Welcome to the 22nd podcast of Rising Tide. This is David Helvarg and my co-host Vicki Nichols Goldstein.
Hello, everyone.
And today we're talking with our friend Geraldine Knatz, professor of practice and policy of engineering at the University of Southern California. From 2006 to 2014, Geraldine was also the first female director of the Port of Los Angeles, also the first marine biologist to run any major port, along with the Port of Long Beach, where she'd also worked as managing director. Her joint ports clean air action plan reduced air pollution in the port complex 70% in 5 years. So along with being past president of both the American Association of Port Authorities, International Association of Ports and Harbors, and having many other titles and honors, including a Peter Benchley Award, I should add. She's what I consider the founder of the global greening ports movement now underway. So Geraldine, welcome. And let's start with a quick background, which is how do you become a marine biologist and how does a marine biologist end up directing a major port?
Oh, well, that's really a good question. Well, first, thank you, David, for inviting me and Vicki. This is going to be great. So, I grew up on New Jersey, and in Jersey, you go to the shore. And, not the beach, it's the shore. And so I studied marine biology when I was at Rutgers, and I was just fascinated with the invertebrates, and I learned how to dive. And so when I came out to California, I was at USC, and they were looking to hire an environmental scientist at the Port of LA. And I went and applied for the job, and I was a diver. And at that time, they had this idea that they could mitigate for habitat destruction. And so their idea was they were going to transplant kelp from Catalina Island to the breakwater in LA Harbor to try and bring back the habitat. And so I was a diver, and so that's how a marine biologist got a job at the port. And so we did that, but of course, in those days, I worked in the water quality lab. We'd go out and test the harbor waters, and in the inner part of the harbor, it was dead. There was no oxygen. It was really bad.
So how did the kelp do?
Well, the kelp, it struggled for many years. And of course, now the harbor it's got great water quality, and the kelp has kind of taken over. It's all the way up the main channel, up under the bridge, and it's just all over the harbor now. So the kelp population's done really well.
That's a good success story.
Yeah,
one of many, I'm sure, that you'll share with us today.
Yeah.
But so you were working in the port as a biologist, and what was your career path out of that?
Well, let me tell you, in those days, biology was sort of the dead end. So I worked in the environmental office, and then they also had an environmental office in the Port of Long Beach. And so the director had retired, and so I applied to run that office in Long Beach, and I got the job. And so over in Long Beach, again, environment at those days was a dead end. And so I kind of had to move into planning and transportation. And then after I did that, I went into development. I also had a background in environmental analysis and things like that. So I kind of worked my way up to the number 2 spot in Long Beach, managing director. And then when Antonio Villaraigosa became mayor and he was looking for a port director, I went back to LA. So
and you thought you weren't going back to LA. Just briefly tell us how your husband helped you get that job.
Oh, so this is a funny story. So, I was at Long Beach, and I was like, oh, why would anybody apply to work in the city of LA? It's so political, they must be crazy. So the job flyer came into my inbox while I was at Long Beach, and I read it, and it was looking for someone who had an environmental background and an international reputation in terms of port environmental issues. And at that time, I was chairing the Port Environmental Committee, the international one. And so I thought, oh my God, this sounds like me. That's really weird. So I submitted the application. And, a week or 2 later, I got a letter saying, thank you for your application, but we have more qualified candidates than you. Bumped me out. And so I thought, well, who could couldn't be more qualified, number 2 at Long Beach for a job at LA. It didn't make sense to me. But I thought, oh, it's political, it's wired for somebody, it's not really an open competition. So my husband says to me, he says, oh, they sent you the wrong letter. I'm like, give me a break. This is a big, big recruiting firm. They're not going to send a wrong letter. He said, no, they sent you the wrong letter. So we went back and forth on this in the kitchen, over the kitchen counter. And finally I said, I'm going to show you, I'm going to call them. And so that was an awkward phone call. Oh, you're dialing. What am I going to say? Hi, I'm Geraldine Knatz. Did you send me the wrong letter? I'm really better than you think. It was like, oh my God. And so I make the call, my husband's standing there, and the woman, she says, okay, hold on. And then I hear her ruffling papers. And I'm like, she comes on, we sent you the wrong letter.
No way.
Yes. And so I was like, okay, that was great. But then of course my husband was right, So then she said, okay, we're sending you a new letter. So, because this is not the end of the story. They sent the new letter, and it had my address, but it was addressed to a man whose name I didn't recognize, setting an appointment for 6 p.m. at a hotel up in LAX, in this room in the hotel. So I thought, oh my God, they just tacked me on the end of the day. And I said, I'm just going to show up in this guy's spot and see what happens. And so I did, and they were expecting me, and I guess the person was, not only sending out the wrong letters, but boilerplating them and not changing the names. And so I showed up, and I wound up getting the job. But yeah, that was really a experience.
You talk about you worked for years in the Port of Long Beach and you didn't like the politics of the Port of LA. When you go there, you can't tell one from the other. This is the largest port complex in the Western Hemisphere. It's got its own AAA map. It's over 20 square miles. People don't understand much about ports. 90% of our goods cross over the docks of America's ports. And I think something like half of all goods made in China cross your port complex. What don't people understand about ports?
You're right. People don't really understand what happens at the ports. I would say a lot of people in Southern California have probably never been to the port, unless maybe they took a cruise, like a Carnival cruise out of Long Beach or LA, or maybe they took the ferry to Catalina. There wouldn't be a reason to draw the average person down to the port. But it is really a fascinating place, and it's San Pedro Bay. You can, take a boat from one side to the other. You can drive your car across Terminal Island, but you don't really know when you've gone from one port to another. When the Panama Canal was opening and they were doing a little marketing brochure, the Panama Canal folks, and they put, San Pedro, the Port of LA on the map, like up, north of Santa Barbara or something. They just got it in the wrong spot. It was just, in those days, not that very important. Of course, now it is extremely important. And half of the cargo coming in through LA and Long Beach gets on a train and goes east of the Rocky Mountains. The second biggest market for LA goods is the Chicago area, America's heartland.
So Geraldine, I live in Colorado, and people might not even make the connection between the ports and small towns throughout the United States. Tell us a little bit more about how important they are and how it actually works to get the goods moved out across America.
Yeah, well, basically, one of the, why LA is so important is not only because of its location on the Pacific Rim, but because it has really great rail and highway connections. As a matter of fact, one time we did a study, and we traced goods coming through the Port of LA to every congressional district in the lower 48, basically, states. And so, of course, this was very handy for cocktail party conversation with a congressperson from anywhere. So, LA, we can say we can ship your goods anywhere. So, people, when you go into the store, they don't make the connection when they take something off the shelf and so many of our goods are made in China, that it came through Los Angeles and Long Beach in most cases.
When you were hired in 2014 at the port, they were looking for an environmental person in large measure because the ports were incredibly polluted. The air pollution was impacting fence line communities, San Pedro, Wilmington, Long Beach, that were largely low income communities of color and the like. And so there's real community displeasures, put it mildly, with the ports. And you can talk about what was happening, how that was impacting the communities in the ports, and how you responded.
Yeah, it actually was 2006 when I made the jump from Long Beach over to LA. And at the time that I went there, neither port had been able to get an environmental impact report before our board and get a project approved for 5 years. And so there was a lot going on in Los Angeles at that time. There was Mayor Hahn, had set up a no net increase in air pollution plan. And they were working on that. And, I was sitting over there at Long Beach, and there was a big call for doing health risk assessments. And so the impact of diesel exhaust as a carcinogen on, the propensity of getting cancer, basically, is what we were doing.
And
so
the port terminals were not expanding because of lawsuits from these communities.
Well, yes, exactly. And there were, everything was sort of like stopped in terms of expansion plans. So while I was at Long Beach, we said, okay, we've got this, future terminal we want to do. Let's run the health risk assessment. We got the results back, and I was shocked at the, the AQMD's threshold is for significance is 10 additional cancer, exposures in 1 million cases. So I was like, I had done that health risk assessment, and LA hadn't done one yet. And it happened then to be the time when I went to interview for the job at LA. And so when I went into the interview, and talking with the mayor, I was able to say, well, one of the things I said in the interview was like, oh my God, we have to get rid of these dirty trucks because they're just driving that health risk. And I learned later that when I said that in the interview, that the board chairman at the time picked up on that and said, this is the person, because he too also had the same view, like, oh my God, we really can't, he and I agreed, no net increase wasn't good enough. You can do an EIR and you get your impacts back to baseline, but the baseline sucked. We had to really reduce emissions. So we had to come up with a plan, which we called the Clean Air Action Plan, that in exchange for development rights to the customers, the port tenants, they had to adopt significant measures that would reduce the pollution well below what they were, generating at that particular time. And so we came up with this plan. And then one of the reasons the mayor told me he hired me is because I came from Long Beach. And so it can't just be LA's plan, because the two ports, the customers like to play one off against the other. And so we had to bring Long Beach along with that. And Mayor Villaraigosa got along with Mayor Beverly O'Neill at the time. And so the two ports did it together. And, we used the power of our tariff. It never really been used. I mean, it's what we use to set.
Let me just go back a second. When you say the two ports work together, so even though when you visit, it looks like a land of giants, giant cranes, giant ships, giant trucks, but the port of LA and Long Beach, they hadn't had a joint port commission meeting since when? The 1920s.
Yes, there were a couple of joint meetings. I actually go over that in my book. It was pretty uncommon. And those meetings were, there was a big effort to try and merge the ports, really on and off for a century. And that prompted some of those meetings. But when we, actually, developed the plan, and we're going to adopt the plan in November 2006, we had this first, it was really the second time in history that there was a public meeting of the two ports of LA and Long Beach. And this time we had both mayors there, and the plan was adopted. And as I said, we were using our tariff where we could set kind of like regulation. And that was challenged. As I tell people, I've been booed and I've been sued, because we basically, for our clean truck program, we were going to ban trucks by model year. They come up to the gate, and if they couldn't get in, we'd block access. And that was challenged all the way up to the US Supreme Court.
And that's because you had thousands of dirty older trucks going in and out of the ports with containers on their chassis. And you said you actually had your plan in depth. So if you lost one case in court, you had another plan, and this was kind of a strategy that really seemed to work. You reduced pollution 70% over the next 5 years.
It was pretty phenomenal. And, we, our goal was 50% in 5 years. But in actuality, we had if you didn't, get rid of the dirty truck right away, we gave people time to do that. Yes, you had to pay a fee when you came in the gate. It was $70. And, for a 40-foot, container coming through. And so the fee was set so that within 18 months, if that truck was coming to the port frequently, you could have bought a new truck for what those fees would amount to. So really, in the space of 2 years, we turned over the entire truck fleet. And so it was kind of, and that was in the depth of our recession. So big Class 8 heavy duty trucks were selling really well in Southern California. It was a bright spot in the economy because they weren't selling anyplace else because of the recession that we were in. And so that's why the plan had such a remarkable success. The other thing is we wanted to, the question of whether the port could regulate the fuel in ships is kind of one that was a little dicey, and so we wanted to get the ocean carriers to go to low sulfur fuel when they got to the AQMD, the boundary of the basin out at sea, like 20 miles out to sea. And so the first iteration of our plan was we will pay the differential in fuel prices between the dirty, heavy fuel that you usually burn and the cleaner diesel. And so we did that for the first year as a way to get the industry on board with making that switch over. A lot of the ocean carriers were like, the ship's going to stall, we'll lose power, but, when they wasn't going to cost them anything to try, they tried. And then many of them got on board with that. And of course, then there was the regulation that came in after that kind of backstopped all of the port plans.
And when the ships came into port, they used to just burn bunker fuel, which is like the dregs of the petroleum process. Now you gave them another alternative as well.
Yes, they hooked to shoreside electrical power. And that was very significant in terms of reducing, because one big container ship, sitting at a berth for one day. I mean, I can't remember the number, but it was, the number of cars equivalency in terms of the pollution it would generate in 24 hours. It's a huge number. But that was also, so the combination of the ship's fuel, shoreside power, and getting rid of the dirty trucks really drove that 70 to 80% reduction in diesel particulates in those very early years of the plan. So,
Geraldine, so with all the initiatives that you took, have you seen other ports adopt to your initiatives? Have you seen improvements in other regions?
Oh, of course, and actually we work pretty closely with the NRDC. And they, and part of their strategy was, hey, they're doing it in LA and Long Beach. You can do it over here. You can do it in these other major urban areas. And of course, one of the things that, LA and Long Beach had working together is really market power. We were big. We were the ones who could start this because, and people called us arrogant because of this, because we knew the customers could not go anyplace else. A plan like this couldn't have started at a smaller port because, the customer would have said, well, if we're not going to come into, Charleston, we'll go to Savannah. There were a lot of options, but LA Long Beach had market power. And this was really a time when they used that market power to drive change.
Well, you sure have made an impact in other regions. And this kind of ties into a little bit of the effort that we're seeing now with the Ocean Climate Action Plan, greening the ports. So do you feel like you're one of the early pioneers to actually help shift this consciousness to get the ports cleaned up and really get them ready for our next, moving into the 2021 and forward?
I guess the answer is yes, but I have to say I had a lot of support from not only our board chairman and the board members. David Freeman was the chairman. He was nicknamed the Green Cowboy, and the mayor put him there because he wanted change. And at one point I had to go to the mayor and say, Mayor, the downside of the clean truck program is we might lose 15% of our cargo volume. Because I had to look at the consequences of this. And, you need to know that, if our numbers drop. And he was like, go for it. And so you don't always get that kind of support. And, but with that support, we were able to do it. And you know what? Those losses did not materialize because all of a sudden the customers saw some benefits to being green and publicizing that they were green. And the early trucking companies with the clean trucks, they were advertising, hey, ship with us because we have the clean trucks, the newer trucks, and you don't have to pay that fee. And that really, their businesses did really well. And that caused then the other companies to really jump on board really quickly. So it was market driven, but as I said, we used our market power.
And in amazing ways. I mean, I use this as an example of really how California takes leadership, where you did the right thing environmentally, ended up selling a lot of clean new trucks in a recession, got the shipping industry on board, dropped the pollution, which translated into public health quality for low-income communities, who dropped the lawsuits, allowed you to expand your terminals, and in a port complex where $1 billion of goods a day crosses those docks. So I think you're the proof that doing right by the environment actually does right by the economy. And, it's an opportunity for expansion, even if you have to drag your customers kicking and screaming to do the right thing.
Right. Yeah. And, I can remember one of the customers saying to me, he said, I remember my first meeting with you. I left thinking, this woman is crazy. And he said, but you were right,
Looking at the possibility of not just ports, but shipping itself moving toward zero emissions and a shift from fossil fuels to clean forms of energy, which is a huge global challenge. Now, you were president of the International Association of Ports and Harbors. How is it working at the global level? Has it begun?
Yes, it has. The International Maritime Organization, which is that part of the UN that deals with ocean shipping and the control of pollution, they have a plan by 2050 to reduce the emissions of shipping by 50%. But the ocean carriers will tell you that they need to have these vessels in 2030 out on the seas in 2035 to make the 2050 goal. So it's like we don't have a whole lot of time for that. And so by not being, aggressive early on, that's where, you really, You don't want to wait till the last 10 years and try to, because it's just not enough time. You really got to go hard in those first years. That's what we did in the Cleaner Action Plan. We really went hard in those first years. It builds that momentum. You can look at the big international banks now in terms of their financing for ships. They want to know the efficiency index of these ships. They don't want to finance, ship purchases that are not going to meet the latest standards. So there's been a lot of international collaboration on the business side.
I wanted to ask you, being a woman in, I would say, a man's world, how did you navigate that? What were some of your challenges? And just, what was going through your head often when you were trying to deal with these difficult issues, being a woman?
Well, I used to go by Jerry. And then when I got my job at the Port of LA, my first job, when I was still a student, I'd leave a phone, call Jerry Knatz. And then the first thing I hear, oh, you're female. Oh, you're female. So then I switched to Geraldine. So I dealt with that issue. When I first started at the port, I was the only female that was not in a traditionally female clerical type position. There were women in HR and in public relations, but in terms of the more hardcore business or science side, I was the only female there. And I can remember it was in 2008, I had a female board president and one of my deputies was female. And we went to Asia and I called it the all-female trade mission. And we went to Shanghai. And we're in a meeting with the chairman of one of the biggest, ocean carriers in the world. And he looks around at us and says, shipping is a man's world. So it's still pretty male dominated, but not as much as it was. And, when you get the job as the, the chief executive, they have to work with you. But there were times in my career at Long Beach where I was told, oh, we can't take you on a trade mission. You wouldn't be respected. I went through all that stuff. So I just kept my nose to the grindstone and just kept working and figured someday that will change. And it did.
Kept your smile, kept your optimism.
Yeah, right.
And when this large shipper says it's a man's world, which it obviously isn't, looking out at you, what did you respond?
We laughed. We laughed at him.
Perfect. Well, you're a real inspiration. I hope that other women and young women and women of all ages listen to this, hear your story, read your book, and recognize that, women's job or woman's world can be anywhere we want. So it's really neat that you paved that way, and really nice that you're continuing on with your career. And we're going to read all about you and hear about you, and just thank you so much for being with us.
Okay. Thank you, Vicki. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Geraldine. Thanks so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Rising Tide is a production of Blue Frontier with host David Helberg and support from Natasha Benjamin, Ellie Curlow, and myself, Vicki Nichols-Goldstein. Rising Tide's editing services and additional technical support are provided by Studio Cape May of San Diego, California. The theme song is written and performed by Ethan Kenbarg. You can find Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast, at www.bluefront.org or download it anytime from Apple, Google, or Spotify.
Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free, the sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier. Off in the salty ocean, off to the blue frontier.
Sparky, come here, buddy. Sparky! There you are, good boy, Sparky.